Andrew Hutchison, and you're in Shawnigan Lake on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Born in Toronto and had a difficult early life. My mother developed cancer when I was very young, and we're back in the early 40s when treatment was not what it is these days. And that resulted in a breakdown of the family. So 3 children were shipped off to boarding schools, myself and my 2 older sisters. And ultimately my mother died while we were away at boarding school. My eldest sister developed schizophrenia and became paranoid and was hospitalized for the next 18 years or so. The huge financial burden of all of that, plus a shift in the economy, meant that my father's fortunes were decimated, and we had a very rough time financially. So they were tough days. From there, I went straight into the working world. I didn't initially go into university. Didn't really know where I was headed and what life was going to deliver, so I experimented a bit. And I went off into the working world and worked in Toronto initially with Clewett Peabody, who were the Arrow Shirt people. And they shipped me off to Winnipeg for a time. And then I came back into Toronto and was assistant to the marketing manager there for a number of years. And from there moved into the point of sale business, and had my own company in wire and sheet metal production and design and production for point of sale stuff. About 110 people working for me, and I'm in my early 20s, and things were going very well indeed. But it was during the course of all of that. Well, I guess I better go back and say that when I got married. While I was with Arrow Shirts, I bumped into this wonderful lady who I'd spend the next 50 years plus with. And I indicated to her at the time that I had some suspicion that perhaps I should be ordained one day. And she said, well, make a choice now, because I don't want a public life. I want my little white picket fence like everybody else. So that was easy, and we got married. And I set up my business. And after a number of years in the business, Lois perceived that my involvement in the church as a volunteer, and times when I would be working closely with and counseling my employees and so on, were the times that really brought me alive. So she said, you really should be ordained, shouldn't you? I said, yes. A psychologist will tell you that your earliest memory has to do with what you value most today. And that turns out to be the case with me, because I remember my baptism. I was over a year of age. I must have been approaching 2 years of age, I guess. And I remember vividly that rainy day as we went into church. I knew exactly what I was wearing. And I remember my godfather being there, and I remember the sun shining as we came out of church. And I was tiny. That's my earliest memory. Earliest memory of faith has to do with a little boy of 6 years of age. And as I mentioned earlier, the family fell apart over my mother's illness and the huge challenge of trying to cope with that. And we were all shipped off to boarding school. I was 6 years of age. And the school was 100 miles away from our home, and in those days that was quite a distance. It might as well have been several thousand. And I was desperately lonely and unhappy and homesick. But the school had a chapel, and those moments in the chapel, we went to chapel every day, morning and evening, for services. And whereas some people of my age might say that was overdosing, it sort of held my world together. And I would go into that chapel by myself on occasion and just sit there. As a little boy of anywhere between 6 and 12, because I was there for 6 years, and I'd look up at a stained glass window, and in the window was a man with a kind face and wearing a crown of thorns and a beautiful robe and holding a lamp and knocking on a door. And there's no handle on the outside of the door. The door is overgrown with vines, can only be opened from the other side. And I would go and sit and look at that window, and there are times I'd imagine myself on one side of the door, and times I'd imagine myself on the other side of the door. But in somehow or other, through that image, I was communicating with someone or something, and finding comfort in that communication.
What's the meaning of the? What was the meaning of the door to you?
Well, the door is shut, and just on the other side of it is this light and life and comfort and kindness, and I desperately want to open the door and let that into my life. And sometimes I sort of imagine myself as holding that lamp and being on the outside of the door, and not quite belonging, not knowing where I belonged, and wishing that somebody would open the door and let me in, because sensing that there is a certain kindness and light and so on in me. The first time would be then. It's a terrible feeling to have your whole family taken away from you, and to be left in this alien environment, and having to find a place. And I, though I'm not sure that at age 6 I would have called that God. I think that is when I desperately needed love in my life, and desperately needed to longing to belong, and I think that's where I found it. And as those years progressed in that school, as I said earlier, those services, morning and evening, sort of framed my day and held me together, and meant everything to me. And I know there are people who resented the necessity of having to do this every day and so on, but it just meant the world to me. So just being in that situation, being absolutely the youngest boy in a community of 110 boys in the early 40s, when life could be pretty rough. My spirituality is very much dependent on a corporate experience, because of those formative years. Because of that daily worship in a body and so on. So my spirituality is liturgical. And the absolute high point in my life is presiding at a liturgy. Just absolutely, this is what I was created for, and that arises out of that. But another thing that arises out of it, the family falling apart. My mother's sick and dying. My mother and father separated. My sisters at a distance, and so on. We reacted differently. One sister went schizophrenic and became mentally ill for years, and eventually developed cancer and died. One sister became angry with the whole world and had great difficulty establishing healthy relationships for the rest of her life. And I became the fixer, the healer, and really wanted to reconcile and pull things together and so on. So in that school environment, which was both healthy and unhealthy, both supportive and destructive, I tended towards people who are on the fringes, trying to bring them into the circle and so on. And that concern for reconciliation and inclusion and so on was with me from pretty early days, and has followed me along since. I went from there, and by the way, survival skills were also learned, and boxing was a major sport at the time. And small as I was determined to make a name there, so I did during those 6 years at Lakefield. Then I moved down to Upper Canada College, which is a much larger institution. There are about 600 boys, I guess, at it. And here again, I was younger than most of the folks in my class. And here I had to assert myself as well. I tried boxing. School was just too big for that, though, and I was wiped by a wonderful guy from Bogota, Colombia, who gave me a serious technical knockout. I decided that wasn't going to be where I'd compete. So I did compete on stage, and as a singer and as an actor, I found my sort of 15 minutes in the limelight, and also it was just post-war, so the cadet battalion was a big noise. We were all children of people who'd been to war, so the cadet battalion was a big thing, and I took that seriously, and I became commanding officer of this group of 400 or 500 young men in uniform. And through those years, the school wasn't particularly religious, and certainly wasn't like my previous experience. There was no chapel. There was a general assembly every morning, and a prayer was said, and a hymn was sung, but it didn't amount to very much. But for all that, the principal of the school happened to be an Anglican priest, not as a constitutional thing, but just by accident. That's what he was. So I developed a relationship with him, and became involved in a local church nearby. I was not a boarder at this stage, by the way. I was a day student living with my father and my sister. And so we went to the local church, and I became deeply involved there, and ultimately headed the youth group, and became a lay reader. It was a lay function, so I could officiate at services and preach and so on. And youth at that point within the Anglican Church was well organized into an outfit called the Anglican Young People's Association that had a provincial organization, a Dominion organization, an international organization. So I became seriously involved in all of that, and I was on their Dominion Council as the Mission Projects Chairman, and that exposed me to missions. And so I became involved in that, and actually went north to during summers to work in missionary situations. And as I graduated from high school and went on to business and so on, I organized young people from Toronto to go north and to live in Native communities and to help them with their infrastructure, you know, building churches and schools and that kind of thing. That meant the world to me. And all the way along the line, there were people who'd put a hand on my shoulder and say, you should be thinking about ordination. And I don't think that ministry and ordination is something that arises totally from within. I think it's definitely something that needs validation from outside, encouragement from outside. And so after many of those experiences, plus what was going on in myself and my own life, I began to realize that's where I should be going.
What was going on inside?
Just a feeling of this is where I should be. This feels so right. You know, friends who were involved in chasing the dollar, and that was really exciting. Friends who were involved in scholarly activities, and that was really exciting for them. And what I was up to wasn't. But what I was up to, working with young people, working with natives in the north, trying to work on this sort of passion for inclusion and reconciliation and so on, all of that just felt so right. You know, that this is what I should be doing. This gives me energy. You know,
what was
this
your
gives me life.
understanding of God?
Well, God is what or who is generating this. You know, the same God who took a lonely little boy and said, you know, you belong and I care and I'm right there at the door. That same God was very much with me, validating so much of what was happening in my life. I'd come home at night, and Lois would notice that it's not the days when I'd come home with a $100,000 order in my pocket that I was really excited, but the days when some guy in the plant had come in because his mortgage had come due and he couldn't do anything about it, and his wife was going to leave him, and I'd spend half a day working with him, and apparently come home and Lois would think, you're a foot taller today, what happened? So all of that eventually said to her, as well as to me, that I really should be doing this with my life and not be distracted by manufacturing wire and sheet metal projects. There, lots of people can do that. So I went back to university, night school to begin with, and got enough undergraduate work that I was admitted to seminary in Toronto, and graduated from Trinity College, and was ordained in 1969. As a student, I was a prison chaplain in the Ontario system, and that was an amazing experience to meet God behind bars, you know, in the lives of people shunned by society and locked up in cages, and there was a gracious, loving God in those cages and in those people, and that was an amazing experience, and again was a faith building experience, definitely. When I went to my first parish, it was in the Haliburton Highlands of Ontario, multi-point parish. There are 5 little churches scattered over the countryside, and having spent so much of my life in a big city, it was an amazing experience to arrive there and feel so totally at home. And I think what was happening was I was clicking into my very early experience at Lakefield as a 6-year-old boy and upward, and somehow or other the familiarity of the countryside and so on spoke to me. So in those years, I considered it such a huge privilege to be driving from church to church to church, and to hospitals at a great distance and so on, and cemeteries at a great distance. And as I drive through, I'd be in my car by myself, and this was my chapel. And I would look around and think to myself, there are people who spend a fortune to come halfway across the world just for a glimpse of this. And I live here. What a privilege. And how absolutely awesome and overwhelming this is. And please don't ever let me lose that sense of wonder and appreciation. And there were some magical moments during those years. I used to take young people out on camping trips by canoe and so on. And the year I left, we were gathered around a fire one night and on an island, and one of the boys was missing. And we're terribly concerned about that. I was terribly concerned about that. And all of a sudden, out in the middle of the lake, this huge fire in the middle of the lake. And a number of them had put together a raft and piled it with wood and stuff, and soaked it with coal oil or something. And one of them had towed this out to the middle of the lake and set it aflame. And I said, this is sort of a thank you and a farewell. It's beautiful.
Those were the days you were known as Father Hutch.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So anyway, there were some magical days there as we went camping, by the way, and the kids did this on their own. As we went camping, we'd land, and the first thing they'd do once they'd cleared a site was they'd build themselves a little altar, and then they'd go around and scrape gum from the trees and make all the preparations for a service. And we'd celebrate the Eucharist there in the middle of the wild, and they'd do all the intercessions. The gum from the trees was made into incense, and they'd be censing the altar and so on. Absolutely amazing moments. And on one occasion, I took a gang of them from a monastery in Bracebridge. They walked 46 miles, not kilometers, but miles, back to Minden. This was a sponsored walk, and I said to them, you're going to suffer, and there are going to be some huge blisters, and it's going to be very uncomfortable. But remember that there are people who walk this far for medical help and to find fresh water and so on. And because you're doing this and you're sponsored for it, some of them won't have to. So they walked that distance. It took them nearly 2 days. And as they arrived at the church, somebody at the church saw them coming and was ringing the bell and so on. As they arrived at church, each one of them, instead of going straight into the hall where everybody was to welcome them, each one of them went into the church and said their prayers and so on. I thought, wow, this is just super. So There've been some amazing moments. Oh, there were lots of struggles. I guess the death of my mother was a huge one. I was only 10. But that was really huge. So the God who had held me together for 3 or 4 years at that point in that school had now sort of let me down by letting my mother die, and die very unhappily and in pain, and still separate from my father and the rest of the family. That was terribly upsetting, and certainly had me very, very angry. And I'm just not sure how I got beyond that. If I got beyond that, maybe it still rankles a bit.
Do you remember a moment where there was some peace around that?
I can't put it to a moment. And as life went on, I learned from my sister more and more of the huge challenge and difficulty that my mother had over 7 years of laboring with that cancer and its effect on her and on the family. And none of that gave me much peace. If anything, it distressed me a little further. It was she who gave me my initial gift of faith, And when I went off to school, at age 6, with me went a Bible given to me by my mother, and inside the cover, "Be strong and of good courage, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest." You're getting up close and personal here.
It's the most intimate.
It is.
Do you still have that Bible, by the way?
I don't. In the many, many moves, somehow or other that got waylaid, and that's been a cause of real concern. I guess I learned that there are some things that are absolutely beyond our understanding or our control. When my mother died, this schizophrenia really kicked in, apparently very, very forcefully. And my father's first answer, understand we're back in the early 40s, my father's first answer was to phone an aunt of mine who was living in Paris and saying, "Could you take Heather for a while? I think a change of scenery and so on just might make a difference." It didn't, and I had to fly her home some weeks later and commit her to an institution where she stayed for years. And just the profound sadness that we all lived with, and that so many people in the world have to live with, in the presence of situations that cannot be changed. And I've always been a fixer, a fixer and a healer, and one thing I did learn there is that some things just can't be changed. Well, that I'm alive and open and caring. I guess that.
Thank you so much for doing this interview. It means a lot to me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Or should I say, toda rabba?
Hutchison.